While I was in the process of revising this script for the umpteenth time, Zoe B released The Art of Writing Video Essays. I asked her in a comment whether the first person to make a video essay on a subject has any sort of responsibility as the creator of a foundational work on that subject in the medium. She kindly replied that her advice would be to leave room for people to build on your ideas. If you know you're first, don't worry about making a comprehensive, all-encompassing video. Just make something that introduces and explains your topic. Remember that you may be the first, but you'll never be the last. One must never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it isn't going to go off. It is wrong to make promises you don't mean to keep. The Omegaverse is a collection of alternate universe fiction settings that began in a niche online community and is now a searchable term in the Kindle store, where you can purchase original wolf kink fiction by archetypal straight white erotica writers, while there are hundreds of thousands of transformative Omegaverse works out there that can never make so much as a ruble on 2/28/2022. Jokes about the inability to monetize transformative works aside, it is Omegaverse's history as a trend in niche fan communities that allowed it to spread beyond transformative works into original English language fiction and eventually into a realm of international fascination. Videos on English language Omegaverse and Japanese Omegaverse yaoi already exist, but I would like to take it 1 or 2 or 10 steps further. I am interested in Omegaverse as a literary tool. I am interested in Omegaverse as a cultural export. You see, Omegaverse is a literary cultural export of the United States. In its decade of life thus far, it has assimilated into the storytelling of other cultures, where it is used to reflect the experiences and ideas of those cultures. While not every aspect of English language Omegaverse translates well, for each gap left in understanding, new concepts for the universe develop and new context to its function is given. Language, medium, and presentation of Omegaverse vary. Does the function of Omegaverse as a fictional setting change in different contexts? How does Omegaverse look through different cultural lenses? If it does look different, how? And more importantly, why? I attempt to answer these questions first by providing basic cultural and literary criticism of Omegaverse through the cultural frame of the United States, then by measuring Omegaverse as a subgenre of its 2 parent modes, and finally by discussing Omegaverse as it is presented through my target frames, those of East Asian comic mediums, Japanese manga, South Korean webtoons, and Chinese manhwa. I propose that Omegaverse is a literary tool for recontextualizing narratives without replacing originals or itself being redundant. Its stories are uniquely equipped to portray creator understandings of the world as we know it, the world as we don't, and the world as a what if. Before continuing, please take a moment to check the list of potentially uncomfortable or triggering content and when to expect it. If you are under the age of 18, I have a social obligation to recommend clicking away, though if you live somewhere with terrible LGBT representation or sex ed, you will likely learn more here than you ever have in school. This project is academic in nature and educational in purpose, so if you want to learn, I encourage you to do so. I only ask that you take extra care while listening. We good, everybody? All right. Now that the cowards are gone, let's talk about werewolf dick! Listen, bestie, your listening experience is all your own. So what I've done is make everything easily navigable with timestamps. I've given you all the information you need to know about potentially triggering content. You just need to skip around. Get to the stuff that you're interested in. Skip the stuff that you're not. It's all good. All the really interesting stuff doesn't come until later anyway. But if you need the sex ed lesson, keep listening from here. And if you don't, good.
Omegaverse is a subgenre of yaoi. Do you know what a knot is? If I had to describe it with a sound, it's like a pop. They have diagrams of the birth canal in the male.
Overall, I find Professor Lando's explanation is appropriate for his audience and his channel. It's nowhere near enough for me, and it is by no failing of his that he barely scratches the surface. Omegaverse is complicated, and opposing literary communities of Omegaverse interest don't acknowledge each other's existence. Original English Omegaverse doesn't acknowledge English fanfiction. English fanfiction doesn't acknowledge non-English fiction. The strongest bridge between any of these is that between Korean language K-pop stan fanfics and English language K-pop stan fanfics. For this reason, there isn't one comprehensive work that encapsulates all that Omegaverse is and does. This one is no exception. It's the length of a doctoral thesis and still doesn't explain everything it could or everything I wanted it to. But it is an attempt at open access research projects outside of academia, utilizing the work of academics, professionals, researchers, and publishers to tackle important questions about Omegaverse that have not been tackled yet in academia.
No way in hell I can afford to go back to school anytime soon, so...
Omegaverse is a subgenre of speculative erotic fiction in which human biology and socialization are based on alpha, beta, and omega dynamics as derived from a debunked study of social hierarchies in wolves. In these dynamics, the alphas are dominant, omegas are submissive, and betas are neutral. I'll be using both Omegaverse and ABO interchangeably to refer to the genre as a whole, but you'll see points where I'm using them to refer specifically to different concepts as well. While characteristics of Omegaverse are shown in fiction at least as early as the concept of Pon farr in Star Trek, the genre itself was bred in the Supernatural fandom. Supernatural was a TV show about two monster hunting brothers, and kinks like werewolves and nodding were hella popular with Supernatural fanfiction writers. May of 2010, this writing prompt was born in a Supernatural Kink community live journal thread.
Request: Jensen/Jared. Alternate universe. Doggy style. Bottom Jensen. AU. Their world is just like ours, except in their world there are two types of men. One is the alpha male, the other is the bitch male. Alpha males are like any ordinary guy, with the exception of their cocks. They work just like dog cocks. The knot, tons of cum, etc. The bitch male is just an ordinary guy without the special cock.
This request was filled 2 months later with the story I Ain't No Lady, but You'd Be the Tramp. The author called it the Tramp verse, or the Tramp alternate universe, due to the request's specific doggy-style details. But this is what we would consider the original Omegaverse story. Within 6 months of this initial prompt, the same request appeared in the same community with additional tags and new terminology that had already become standardized.
Request: J2. Animal traits: claiming, nodding, Dom Jared, Sub Jensen, impregnation. There are 3 types of men: alpha males, beta males, and omega males. Alpha males are like any ordinary guy with their cocks. They work just like canines. The knot, tons of cum, strong breeders, etc. The beta male is an ordinary guy without the special cock. Omega males are capable of childbearing and often called bitch males.
East Asian Omegaverse is markedly different from the English language erotic fanfiction that inspired it. But someone who reads ABO fanfiction should be able to follow along with East Asian ABO. And since my work is interested in East Asian ABO, I'll be using those conventions to explain the Omegaverse universe? None of the presuppositions of the world are hard rules, but they will be relevant whether you're reading Japanese manga, Korean webtoons, or Chinese manhwa. Common wisdom of East Asian Omegaverse is that in addition to biological males and females, there are 3 sets of secondary sexual characteristics in humans. These are labeled as alpha, beta, and omega characteristics. In Japanese Omegaverse manga and South Korean Omegaverse webtoons, these are alpha, beta, and omega secondary genders. Alphas make up the top percentage of the population. They are less common than betas and more common than omegas. Alpha males have a knot at the base of the penis that occasionally swells during intercourse. While knotting inside of a partner, alphas release legions of mighty sperms with the intention of impregnating their mate. Because knotting is known to cause an alpha physical pain, alpha males have an exceptionally poor capacity to deal with blue balls. Alpha females are typically depicted as having a female reproductive system with the exception of a retractable phallic organ instead of a clitoris. Depending on the narrative, they may be depicted as having an underdeveloped female reproductive system in favor of their male reproductive system. Alphas experience heat periods called rut that can be triggered irregularly by omega pheromones. During rut, alphas become more aggressive, territorial, release stronger pheromones more frequently, and are more sensitive to the pheromones of others. Betas are the average human population, making up the majority. They exist in the fictional biological binary of male and female that our world is accustomed to. Betas can receive dominant or recessive alpha and omega genetic traits as any other genetic trait. This may increase the odds of producing an alpha or omega child regardless of their partner's secondary gender. Having alpha or omega traits in the bloodline may also affect how a beta interacts with alphas and omegas. A beta with omega genes in frequent contact with alpha pheromones may develop omega-like characteristics. Or, if they have alpha genes and are in frequent contact with omega pheromones, they may develop alpha-like characteristics. As betas, they can sense and respond to alpha and omega pheromones, but they are less sensitive than alphas and omegas are. Omegas constitute the bottom, and rarest breed, of the human population, of which omega females are the vast majority. Omegas are typically smaller, milder, and all-around softer than alphas and betas. Omega males are depicted as having underdeveloped male genitalia and a functioning womb. The male omega's rectum self-lubricates similar to a female reproductive system. Omega females are effectively the same as beta females with the exception of omega pheromones and estrus cycles. Omegas experience seasonal estrus cycles known as heat periods that can be triggered irregularly by alpha pheromones. During heat, omegas become overwhelmed by a painful need for intercourse. Their bodies produce a heavier flow of self-lubrication called slick during this period of heightened fertility. An omega in heat may become feverish or physically ill until their body's craving is satisfied. The pheromones released during an omega's heat are unique from and more potent than regular pheromones. There are stories with only alpha and omega secondary sexual characteristics, and there are stories with additional classifications of humans and humanoid species. Examples of this include humanoid classifications like human, human-beast, beast-human, predator and prey animal characteristics, elemental affinity within magic systems, other category-based hierarchies. The idea you need to get here is categories and hierarchies. Asterisk.
Can men get pregnant? Is it possible? Yes.
Ugh, Shen Vapiro. My beloved twink. Pregnancy happens in Omegaverse the same way as it does in our world. Little spermy swimmers meet eggs and meiosis happens, with the same gestational periods and nuisances that come from having a wee one develop inside the womb. The only marked difference from pregnancy in reality is the capacity for those with exclusively male genitalia to get pregnant. Alpha males and females can impregnate anyone with a womb. When an alpha knots while barebacking a partner with a womb, the chances of that partner getting pregnant are dramatically increased up to guaranteed pregnancy with an omega that's in heat while the alpha is in rut. Beta males can impregnate beta females and are infrequently shown as capable of impregnating omegas as well. Beta females can be impregnated by alpha males and beta males. Omega males can be impregnated by alphas and occasionally beta males. And rarely they're shown as capable of impregnating beta females and other omegas. Omega females can be impregnated by alphas and occasionally beta males. And there are rare instances where alpha and beta males are shown as capable of carrying children as well. Pairing, also known as mating or bonding, is a mechanism by which an alpha and omega are connected by an exchange of pheromones. While pheromone production is heightened during arousal, sex, or heat-rub periods, the alpha uses their sharpened canines to bite the back of the omega's neck where the scent gland is located. They release either their pheromones or claiming venom into the open wound via saliva. The injury scars over, and the omega is marked as belonging to that alpha. Fated pairs or fated mates are a soulmate bond that typically exists between alphas and omegas. This is presented in any number of ways across stories. Sometimes it's an urban legend, sometimes it's real. Scientifically speaking, we would understand this fate as a biological compatibility that alphas and omegas can pick up on through pheromones. The scent of a fated mate's pheromones are unique from all other pheromones. The attraction between a fated pair is supposedly irresistible, and the bond is supposedly unbreakable. Famous last words. These presuppositions are based on East Asian ABO comics, but not all East Asian ABO comics are the same by any means. All of these premises are flexible, and they differ within their own countries as much as they differ between Japan, Korea, and China. The only consistent presupposition of Omegaverse across mediums and cultural boundaries is the existence of at least alpha and omega as secondary sexual characteristics. Feels like I'm teaching a sex ed class. How'd I do? What if I had a teaching evaluation at the end of this and every person I know that watched it just gave me the worst marks and I lost my proverbial teaching license? Oh god. In this economy. Yeah, I honestly probably deserve it for this. CJ the X has a video titled Objectively Bad Art, in which they briefly criticize the phenomenon of moralizing things we don't like.
If you see something morally reprehensible, why would you spend your time inside of it? Just leave it alone to die. It sucks, it's gross, and I hate it.
We make value judgments when passing criticism on creative works and subconsciously ask questions like, what do I get from this work? What is it not doing that I wanted it to do? Things that don't fulfill our expectations or desires are bad because they are stupid and don't do what they should. And if we don't like a thing, it must be bad to us. Or bad for us, and if it is bad for us, it must be bad objectively, and if it is bad objectively, it must actively have a negative effect on the world around us.
Bad art is a cultural concept created the moment that we experience something and we don't like it. Then after the fact, we go out of our way to justify it. Bad art is our need to express that we don't like something.
Listen, bestie, I'm not going to call ABO problematic. ABO is obviously inherently problematic for a variety of reasons, but we're born without our consent and forced to exist against our wills under the coercive structures of neoliberal capitalism, and that is extremely problematic. So as far as I'm concerned, we're even. In the beginning, I got into ABO because I was disgusted by it. From what I saw early on, I was justified in hating it, and I hated it. At least, I thought I hated it. I mocked ABO in ways that I now realize were worth mocking me over. My opinions were rooted in that disgust and resulted in the moralization of the entire Omegaverse genre. I thought Omegaverse was dumb and gross and bad. I can say academically that it is only one of those things. But those bad opinions came from a place where having a clear-cut take on the existence of Omegaverse mattered more to me than understanding my own take and whether or not that take was any good. And what makes a good take? What makes a good opinion? What value did my opinion even have? I wanted my opinion on Omegaverse to have value, so I became an expert. And I'd hedge a safe bet that I'm among the most knowledgeable people on this beautiful flat earth about Omegaverse, and among an even smaller group specifically pertaining to East Asian Omegaverse. Now that I'm at this point, with a valuable opinion on Omegaverse, what is my good opinion? My one singular opinion on Omegaverse is that there is no one opinion that dominates spaces of people who consume ABO. ABO receives attention in enough different spaces that views toward ABO in those spaces are more so reflections of any given space than they are reflections of ABO. The way Anglophone fan communities treat ABO is not how ABO is treated in East Asian boys' love spaces. And the way East Asian boys' love spaces treat ABO is not the same as how straight white ladies writing original ABO fiction treat ABO, or how Omegaverse TikTok treats ABO, or how the niche of Omegaverse text-based fanfiction stories on YouTube treats ABO. And none of that is how Lindsay Ellis had to experience ABO. There is an overlap in interest across these groups, but everything that makes up the interest that these spaces and individuals in them have is different. Prior to this project, I hadn't thought much about the way that I formulate opinions. Humans rarely do. The bad opinions I once held toward ABO didn't stand up to the scrutiny of reading, evidence, or effort. They were rooted in a bad faith desire to poke fun at a dumb and gross and bad, only one of those things, erotic genre. Moralizing any form of kink fiction is dumber and grosser and badder than pretending wolf-like dick kink is the worst thing I've ever read, or even the worst thing I've read today. So I'd suggest that when it comes to literary and media criticism, a good opinion should be testable and falsifiable. If an opinion doesn't hold basis in reality, it's closer to a belief or an idea, maybe a faith. Formulating opinions based on assumptions, gut feelings, incomplete information, or the like is very not good. Discriminatory biases from racism to transphobia are consequences of demonstrably incorrect opinions being allowed to speak with the same authority as evidence which demonstrates that demonstrable incorrectness. I'd also hope that a good opinion is held in good faith. If an opinion is not sincere in its intentions, it's being held for a negative purpose, and it's hard to justify trusting that opinion. And by saying something is just your opinion when you cannot explain why you hold that opinion or justifying that opinion, it's not an opinion. It's a Swiss Army knife disguised as a get-out-of-jail-free card. It is an excuse. Saying it's dumb and gross and bad is enough for me as long as you genuinely believe it's dumb and gross and bad. And if you hold the opinion that it's dumb and gross and bad in good faith, I expect that you are willing to change it should you realize that it's either A, demonstrably incorrect, or B, doing you or others more harm than good to continue holding that opinion. I feel that this is important to talk about because from this point forward there is a lot of controversial subject matter. I want you to be able to have thoughtful conversations about it. And to do that, we need to not moralize fiction or the process of literary media or cultural criticism. We need to not moralize and we need to not project. Realies over feelies with the intent of deconstructing said feelies. All of this is to say that there is no room for anti-TERF swerf or any phobic attitudes when approaching the subject of Omegaverse. Because really, I ask you, what are our opinions, if not hypotheses about how the world should be?
A person who practices frauduristic acts is known as a frauteur. I'm gonna give that one a... I don't want to do this video anymore.
Let's talk about sex. For fun this time. The foremost function of ABO fiction is as kink. Kink refers to any non-conventional sexual practice, concept, or fantasy, coined for use towards things that are kinks or bends in sexual interest. Kinks are alternatives to vanilla sex, which covers conventional sex across the commonly accepted range of sexual activity. Kinks are often referred to interchangeably with fetishes colloquially, but to distinguish them for academic purposes, fetishism is a sexual fixation on a non-living object or non-genital body part. Sexual fixation on a non-genital body part is also known as partialism.
My old friend Vor.
Regarding the medical diagnosis of fetishism, the fetish must be present for the fetishist to be aroused, and fetishes can be psychologically and sexually debilitating. in recent times, there's been a push to recategorize the diagnosis of fetishism as an obsessive or compulsive personality trait. Because in those cases, the issue isn't that the fixation is on sex, but the fact that the fixation exists in the first place. Common kinks that appear in stories featuring ABO dynamics include, but are not limited to... I hope my mic felt that vibration. Furries! I have never been excited to say furries in my entire life. Furries are fans of anthropomorphic animals, or animals with human characteristics. Dubious consent. These are situations in which whether or not a sexual act has been consented to is uncertain. Nodding is when the fat canine knot swells during intercourse. Possessiveness, owning another and developing feelings of jealousy or envy surrounding that other. Biting includes leaving marks of ownership and claiming another as territory all over their body, in particular the scent gland at the back of the neck. Catching others masturbating. Truly, nothing is hotter than returning from work to see your beloved Omega curled up in a nest of your clothes, repeatedly nutting into your suit jacket. First times. This might be a manga thing or a romance thing, I am not entirely sure, but the consensus seems to be that having sex with another person at any point before the current partner is bad, and it's normal to have feelings of jealousy surrounding past relationships. Breeding, not without a K, to be confused with pregnancy kink. Breeding kink pertains to the desire to breed and or to be bred. You know, like submissive and breedable, dominant and infertile, that chart. Pregnancy, or the attraction to pregnant people and the erotic interest in conversations surrounding pregnancy. Domesticity, or interest in everyday life things between couples like grocery shopping, kisses, hugs, cute social media posts, sharing bank accounts, paying bills, filing joint taxes. Swoon. Primal behaviors, or acting on carnal desires without regard for social... Holy shit. Primal behaviors, or acting on carnal desires without regard for social convention. No foreplay. When females and male omegas can self-lubricate, because they self-lubricate, they apparently do not need any form of preparation or foreplay before intercourse. Please, for the love of God, do foreplay. Spit, water, jizz, and discharge and sweat, dude, they don't count as lubricants. They don't actually work, contrary to what fiction wants you to believe. Prostitution. The kink surrounding prostitution is a little complicated, and the way in which a character became a prostitute may vary, but selling one's body isn't uncommon in Omegaverse. Feminization, or making a masculine figure soft. Humiliation. This would be embarrassing one's partner, like alphas that want to humiliate betas by forcing them to submit, betas that want to humiliate alphas by asserting dominance over the stronger secondary gender, and omegas that might want to humiliate alphas by taking control of the uneven power dynamic, that sort of thing. And emasculation. This is when we call a figure's masculinity into question and make them look and or feel less masculine. Castration, emotional castration at the very least. And should none of these kinks interest you, nay, should they outright disturb you, we still have to acknowledge that they are relevant companions to the ABO kink. We do not have to like these kinks to see where they have a place in these stories, and what the use of these kinks in these stories can say about ABO and vice versa, because physical intimacy is a requirement of the genre that does not go unspoken. It is possible to find tasteful sex or minimal quantities of sex, but nobody actively pursuing Omegaverse fiction is looking for stories specifically lacking sex. This is a generalization, but the exceptions to it are near non-existent. Believe me, I would know. Circling back to the idea of good opinions, what we feel is less important than why we feel when it comes to critically thinking about our own opinions and the opinions of others. After reading far too much ABO for my own good or the good of any reasonable, well-adjusted adult individual, I can confidently express what this genre is not. What isn't a basic expectation, or what isn't the norm for these stories. Especially the stories told via East Asian comics. Omegaverse is not defined by male pregnancy. The fanfiction that introduced me to Omegaverse was a polyamorous romance involving 2 alphas, 2 omegas, and 1 beta. Both omegas got pregnant during the story, with the omega female at the harem's center carrying at least 1 child, and the omega male carried another. The first Omegaverse comic I came across was a Korean webtoon, which spurned my disgust in the beginning, and it dedicated multiple chapters to the omega male's pregnancy with his future mate's child. During this pregnancy, the omega shrunk. He went from already feminine looking to kind of a shota by the time he gave birth. Like, he became a small, soft, shitty baby, and for a lot of reasons, this made me uncomfortable, so I read like 40 chapters of Love is an Illusion total before giving up. Boy, am I glad I enjoy suffering, because this was a horrible introduction to ABO. The polyamorous romance in the fanfiction was so good, and the main relationship in the webtoon was so infuriating, and both had a major story beat that made me severely uncomfortable. And yet, the vast majority of ABO I've consumed didn't show anyone getting pregnant. Even if breeding kink was present, and even in fanfiction, and especially East Asian ABO comics. If a character did get pregnant, the pregnancy and birth giving usually happened off-screen. This was a pleasant surprise for me. On the flip side of this, stories featuring male pregnancy, or mpreg, are not inherently ABO stories, no matter how similar they look. One comic I read was Pregnant in Boys School. It's a webcomic about a teenager who is a pregmen, where pregmen are males who are capable of giving birth and go through a seasonal rut period, but they were created artificially, and that trait kind of evolved into a naturally occurring one, but it's a physical characteristic as opposed to a gender or sex or identity, and the ABO dynamic isn't present, so pregmen, not omegas. How does any... This is where the pregnancy kink comes in. Omegaverse is not some furry shit, nor is it anthropomorphic animal shit, nor is it people with animal quality shit. Asterisk. Because of its naughty history and questionable ties to sex that may or may not be with or between animals or animal-like people, it is very easy to fall into the idea that ABO is inherently in that vein. And there is also that the alpha-beta-omega dynamic was initially coined by a wolf researcher, and the name of that dynamic became the basis for the animalistic social qualities in ABO fiction. But it only specified that it was relevant to captive wolves, and it was in a human-dominated environment, and it became more relevant for humans than for wolves themselves, so, caste systems, my dude. Let's play a quick round of my favorite hit primetime game show, Omegaverse, not with a K at the front of it. My Beast Sons in Heat is a world of anthropomorphic animals and beast people with heat rut periods. An adopted wolf pup falls in love with his human dad and tries to knot with a K his dad during his first heat, and he's in pain, so he cries that his dad will not take his knot with a K, and there are not ABO dynamics, therefore not Omegaverse. Beast Storm takes place in a world of humans with animal qualities. Heat rut cycles are present. Males can be impregnated, and females can impregnate. There are dominant and recessive genetic traits that give people alpha and omega-like qualities. There are even social hierarchies, but these are not alpha, beta, and omega dynamics, secondary genders, or understandings of hierarchies. Therefore, not Omegaverse. Caste Hate is a world of humans with animal qualities and anthropomorphic animals. There's a dynamic at play between predator and prey species first and foremost, but there are heat-rut cycles, fated pairs, male pregnancies, and stated alpha-beta sexual and social dynamics that affect society's landscape. This is Omegaverse. To make a delicious Omega squeak is a world of humans with animal qualities that, poof, transform into full-blown animals. Animal people here are dichotomized also by whether they are a predator or prey species, but there are also heats, ruts, alpha, beta, and omega secondary genders and dynamics, therefore, Omegaverse. Yes, you did so well! I'm so proud of you! Thank you so much for playing! Omegaverse is not supernatural fiction. Supernatural male pregnancy fiction is not Omegaverse. The average Omegaverse story doesn't treat the ABO dynamic as a supernatural element. Instead, these characteristics are part of human biology and therefore a part of the world as anyone in that world would know it. And so, Omegaverse is not supernatural. Now, when saying supernatural mpreg fiction is not Omegaverse, I am referring to stories in which the male pregnancy is not a natural part of the human or human stand-in species, but is instead part of the story's supernatural element. An example of this would be the comic Bloodlink, where female lycanthropes are extinct, but a male lycanthrope is capable of having a female spirit, which gives him female reproductive traits. There's no ABO dynamic present. There are heats, ruts, and male pregnancies, but the context is such that the pregnancy itself being possible is supernatural. And so, supernatural male pregnancy is not Omegaverse. I was scrolling through the Omegaverse on Amazon again, because I hate myself, and I find it really interesting that mpreg is the stuff that's labeled and all the— Look at these! Look at these covers! This is exactly like scrolling through any other romance. Wait, what the fuck? Okay, I didn't notice this one before. And last hasty generalization. Omegaverse is not BDSM. For a kink, ABO isn't all that kinky. The kinky aspects of ABO are vanilla in the context of ABO and are vanilla in general by my measures, so I don't know how I ever thought I'd get a healthy dose of BDSM out of ABO. Alphabet. Letters. Keep up, come on, you can do it. Not to out my questionable reading habits here, but ABO on the whole is wildly tame compared to some other kinks out there. The genre's appeal includes this primal animalistic sex, but on the grand political compass of normal, socially acceptable sex to hardcore subversive kink sex, ABO is necessarily in the normal, socially acceptable quadrant. Relative to the archetypal straight white woman, ABO fiction belongs in the same category as, say, 50 Shades the Mister or the movie 365. It isn't hardcore, and it's way too popular to be subversive. BDSM, or bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadomasochism, might be the first thing that comes to mind when an unsuspecting person hears the term kink, and they may incorrectly assume, as I did, that kink fiction involving dominant alphas and submissive omegas is a BDSM-related kink. It is not. Not with no okay, you know what, you get it. There are dom-sub undertones, but it's not necessarily BDSM. There are good ABO stories featuring BDSM, but the ABO dynamic is written in such a manner that desires BDSM satisfies in intimate and sexual relationships are inherently satisfied by the ABO dynamic. Separate from both BDSM and Omegaverse, there's a dom-sub speculative fiction subgenre where dominant and submissive are the secondary genders. In the dom-subverse, the difference between BDSM enthusiasts and the dom-sub gender spectrum is that a sub cannot disobey a dom's orders, and a dom cannot disobey the safe word. Subs are compelled to obey doms, and doms are compelled to care for subs. Osuwari yoku dekimashita. From today on, my idol will be my master, and inu wa kogorate hizamazuku are examples of dom-sub speculative universe comics I read. Honey, the housekeeping is done. It's 4 p.m. Come downstairs so we can discuss Omegaverse as a speculative universe concept. It'll be great. To do that, I'll be using varying types of literary criticism. Ooh. Much of which will sound like a shitpost. And for this, I am sorry, but I am in fact very serious about everything I am saying here. This is analysis of Omegaverse as a concept. Understanding theoretical criticisms of Omegaverse makes it easier to see the ways in which Omegaverse changes when filtered through different cultural lenses. Where do we even begin with this? To start, Omegaverse is some Lovecraft shit. Yeah, it's got the body horror and the looming threat of the unknown, and it's perpetuated by perverse sexual desires, all like the work of H.P. Lovecraft. But the genre evolutions that take place for the Omegaverse and Lovecraft shit rely on an ecosystem of diverse collaborators sowing their idea seeds in different soils at different altitudes and watering with different water, some of which may or may not be contaminated. Ooh. You see, every variable in the development process of a fiction genre affects how that genre blossoms. In the paper The Toy Soldiers from Leeds, the slash palimpsest, Dr. Mafalda Stasi proposes the metaphor of the palimpsest for discussions of slash fiction, where slash fiction refers to fan fiction following romantic relationships between characters of the same sex. It's gay fan fiction. Slash fiction equals gay fan fiction. It's gay. By viewing the vast slash corpus as a diverse and dynamic one, and considering each individual text in its own terms, a richer, more in-depth connection among genre and style is permitted. The term palimpsest here is used to indicate a non-hierarchical, rich layering of genres, more or less partially erased and resurfacing in a complex continuum of themes, techniques, voices, moods, and registers. For posterity, the word palimpsest is defined as writing material used one or more times after earlier writing has been erased. Think clay tablets and dry erase boards and Etch-a-Sketch. So Dr. Stasi's paper was published in 2006. I was way too dumb to understand this academic explanation of gay fanfiction at 13 years old, but it didn't stop me from writing gay fanfiction at 13 years old, and anyone who has participated in slash consumption or creation can understand the idea at the core of Dr. Stasi's proposal. I will never get to take ABO 7 Minutes in Heaven quizzes. Why live? Slash readers and writers are writing for themselves and each other. While the writing of the story is often a solitary act, the story itself and its very existence are communal in nature. As Stasi puts it, far from being a fixed and unproblematically shared set of references, the slash canon is based on a collective interpretive process. It is not monolithic even within a given fandom. It is possible to outline a continuum, going from quite basic, hard-to-dispute facts, such as the occupations of the main characters, to highly debatable points of characterization. To throw it back a little, the Supernatural Kink Community Live Journal thread requested that Jared be the alpha and Jensen be the bitch male. And there was no rule for this, but there was general consensus within that community of Jared being the top and Jensen being the bottom. I really hope that neither of them ever see this. I will feel so fucking guilty. I am so sorry. I promise I didn't want to bring either of them up, but it's impossible to remove Omegaverse from its history. Stasi points out that the intertextual nature of the slash palimpsest resembles the intertextual nature of poetry and mythology from hundreds, even thousands of years ago. This is the way the creative works interact with each other. In the paper, slight dubcon, but they both wanted it hardcore, erotic fanfiction as a form of cultural activism around sexual consent, Dr. Milena Popova suggests that the Omegaverse as a whole can be read as an archive or a palimpsest, a densely intertextual body of work rather than a collection of individual works, where stories build on each other as much as on the source material. So like cosmic horror is also a palimpsest, right? Cosmic horror, eldritch horror, Lovecraftian horror, whatever type of horror you want to call it, as we know it, has largely taken inspiration from the work of H.P. Lovecraft. If you don't know who this is off the top of your head, he's the dude who wrote about the space noodles. Some of his recognizable titles include The Shadow over Innsmouth, The Dunwich Horror, and The Call of Cthulhu. During the not-so-height of his not-so-illustrious career while alive, Hewlett-Packard Lovecraft had a group of friends that became known as the Lovecraft Circle. This circle was a group of writers that borrowed Lovecraft's motifs and themes and ideas in their own work, and in exchange, he would borrow ideas from the works of those who borrowed from him. On a meta level, these texts discussed each other and interacted with each other. And narratively, they built outward on Lovecraft's concepts, then fed the new material back into Lovecraft's collection, resulting in his own work interacting with others as much as theirs interacted with his. Other writers' ideas became canon in Lovecraft's larger canon. Every creative work that interacts with Lovecraft's literature is contributing to the larger body of Lovecraftian horror, which only exists because creators continue to toy with and build upon his original ideas. Lovecraftian horror, whether film or book or audio drama, relies on the audience's knowledge of the genre's intertextual origins. I adore unknowable space horrors. I've seen Color Out of Space 2019 3 times because I think that movie is absolutely phenomenal as far as an adaptation and interpretation of a work goes. And when I watched it with the homies, I had a fantastic viewing experience each time. Like, my number one homie and I are like that. We're those kinds of viewers where you just like pause and stop and you talk about the movie as it's going because that's part of the experience of watching and enjoying a movie. But I watch it with my grandmother after, who's super old and who has read literally hundreds of books and has seen literally thousands of movies. And it's not like she's going to remember this after the fact, but she's really into action and mysteries and thrillers. And as we're watching this, my poor grandmother is staring at the screen and her face is all scrunched up. And by the end, she's asking all these questions that I can't really answer either. What was the purple? Ew, these bugs are freaky. Did they really have to kill the dog? What exactly was the entity? Can someone please tell me what happened to the llamas or the mother and why they had to be fused all disgusting like this? And wow, this is actually some really good, odd Nick Cage acting.
Well, it's like I said. Yeah, we're a family.
No.
The car is not happening.
And I'm like, Mar, I don't know. And honestly, I don't think the author did either. The director definitely knew what they were doing. Like, giving kind of a close third perspective to a black water tester in a Lovecraft work. Let's come up with some whack eldritch horror symbolism for how the ash at the end of Color Out of Space was like alluding to all of the whitewashing and horrible attitudes of Hewlett-Packard Lovecraft. I've honestly forgotten his middle name at this point. I know his name is Howard, but I can't remember his real middle name and I can't stop saying Hewlett-Packard. So, with other palimpsests like it, Lovecraftian horror has a continuum of canon, where some parts of the genre are hard to dispute facts, like the unknowable natures of the horrors presented at the bottoms of the oceans or in the stars beyond. And some aspects are highly debatable, like whether or not black people should exist. Thanks, racist Hewlett-Packard! The entire genre of cosmic horror is built on the back of the original H.P. Lovecraft fandom of like 4 whole people that gave a shit about H.P. Lovecraft's writing while he was alive. Research and acknowledgement of H.P. Lovecraft's work didn't start till like the late 20th century. This is a very new thing. And I wanted an excuse for people to listen to this shitty Lovecraft ABO I wrote months ago. Enjoy!
A young Howard shuddered as a cool breeze pushed past his curtains. It was a breeze foretelling something he never could have expected. Yes, that cool autumn air on a cool October night did not stay cool, for he was about to experience something cooler. A dripping tentacle slithered over to the windowsill and crawled across his floor, approaching him slowly as if performing a mating dance. Warmth filled his groin, and his trousers grew uncomfortably tight as liquid pooled between his legs. This unfamiliar sensation thrilled him, frightened him. The tentacle wrapped around Howard's calf muscle. He quivered in anticipation. The fluids from both him and the tentacle soaked his pantaloons. All Howard could think about was his desire to be penetrated by this tentacle, and impregnated by it. Even though it was dark and terrible as night, he wanted it. Badly. The first blackened thing he'd ever wanted. Ah, yes. It was his first heat, brought by the ethereal presence of an elder god hovering outside his window. His fated mate had appeared. His mate was a horror, and so was he.
Our conceptualization of gender and sexuality norms does not exist in Omegaverse, but Omegaverse reinforces heteronormative and cisnormative structures despite being exceedingly freaking gay and necessarily queer. In general, sexuality in ABO by our measures is fairly fluid. There is more bi and pansexuality in ABO since the main sexual divide isn't between males and females. And ABO's roots are in slash fiction, so it tracks that gay ABO is significantly more common than het ABO, especially in East Asian comics where they're already coming with a lag time from the genre's creation to what it is now. There are heterosexual East Asian ABO comics out there though. Some of the straight ABO manga I read include Yo Geisha Alpha to Keiji Omega, Gokudo to Omega, Muki Dashi no Katsuai, Hatsujo Sudra Unmei Eritur Alpha no Risei Genkai, Hatsujo Gonbyon Mai Pankatsu Arasa Airu Sanjie Alpha no Oji ni Ararate Mas, and Anata Janai tu Ikenai Unmei Gobusata Omega Dakiraina Alpha Tuban Temashita. You have no idea how many times I've tried to pronounce Japanese words throughout the extent of this project. As far as I'm concerned, even if my inflection sucked there, I just nailed those. I also started the Chinese manhwa Transmigrating Through Every World to Be Your Black Lotus and the Korean webtoon Love is an Illusion, The Queen.
I'm so sick of Love is an Illusion.
There is also a small but present niche of lesbian-centered East Asian Omegaverse comics out there. There aren't many, and I found quite a few that were only 1 or 2 chapters. Unfortunately, I only managed to find a couple that were ongoing and big. The Korean comic Best Friends I read from start to finish, and the Chinese comic Your Taste is a Little Sweet started while I was working on this, and oh my god, it is so good. There is but one way in which ABO sexuality across cultures and mediums has been impossibly exclusive to date, and that is the complete erasure of aromantic and asexual people. Representation for aro and ace folks in ABO comics are completely non-existent, and while I am currently writing an ABO fanfiction with an asexual protagonist, I haven't found any others. And in addition to erasing this population, the sexuality norms of ABO aggressively promote a metanormativity, the assumption that a central, exclusive, amorous relationship is normal for humans, in that it is a universally shared goal and that such a type of relationship is normative and that it should be aimed at in preference to other relationship types. A metanormativity is romantic relationships that are monogamous are for everybody. Sexuality may be more fluid in ABO than in hentai, barely, but gender and gender presentation relative to biological sex and sexual characteristics aren't. Presentation on a male to female spectrum is frequently shown to be fluid regardless of medium, but presentation on that spectrum is only as fluid as a character's expression of their secondary gender. In East Asian Omegaverse BL in particular, performance of gender is understood as the performance of alpha, beta, and omega characteristics as opposed to the presentation of male-female non-binary identity or male-female biological sex. Asterisk. Taking into account all the reading I did, it was a lot of reading. I would argue that gender-related presentational norms in ABO have the capacity to be stricter than our own in real life. The expectation is that a person looks their secondary gender even if they don't look their primary biological sex. As an example, the protagonist of the manga Koishite Baby is a muscular burlesque dancer Omega. At work, he's sexualized and romanticized. Outside of work, he's ostracized. He fears that his alpha best friend will never fall in love with him, and he can't imagine an alpha wanting to impregnate him even though he wants a family and he's a good Omega, and he dreams of someday wearing a wedding dress, but he believes that his body doesn't belong in one. There's anxiety over whether or not he is Omega enough to deserve love from others or from himself. And you can see how approaching presentation on an alpha-beta-omega axis would result in the erasure of transgender and non-binary identities in Omegaverse, more so in East Asian comics than in English fanfiction, but it's complicated. We'll get into it. This inflexibility of secondary gender presentation branches into the inflexibility of relationship dynamics. The alpha-beta-omega dynamic at the core of Omegaverse fiction is reinforced in societal hierarchies, obviously, but it's very real on an interpersonal level in many stories. There are stigmas surrounding pairings that do not fit the scripts of what constitutes a normal relationship in any given story. For Japanese manga, Norainu no Yoru is a thriller starring an alpha police officer being pursued by a beta doctor, and the beta doctor repeatedly brings up how an omega would be better suited for the alpha physically and romantically. Kurui naku no wa boku no ban beta and Eritu Omega wa Yoru ni oborete are both office-setting love triangles featuring beta and omega main pairings with an alpha and social expectations as obstacles preventing the main relationships from coming to fruition. Korogari ochite ame to muchi is a historical piece in which the protagonist grows up living as an alpha, but when he turns 17, his family sells him to a human trafficking and prostitution shop where he's trained to be a supreme bitch with the objective of one day being sold to a rich alpha, and he develops feelings for a beta there and has to, fight for them to be together. For Korean webtoons, the protagonist of Reversal has an alpha older brother that's engaged to wed a female alpha, and is admonished by their parents when he chooses to break it off because he'd rather be with his male omega mate. The alpha protagonist of Define the Relationship has a lot of internalized self-loathing and can't sexually perform with omegas because of the pressure that comes with producing an heir, and his psychologist recommends that he try sleeping with an alpha instead, and that gives him some amount of inferiority complex. And Chinese manhwa is complicated. Asterisk. One of the reasons that relationship dynamics are treated as systemically inflexible, particularly in East Asian ABO comics, in the same way that they are in the patriarchal United States of America, is childbirth. Because keeping within the script of alpha-omega and beta-beta relationships, or whatever relationships produce children, is a benefit to society because these pairings are the most likely to produce ideal offspring, and that ideal offspring may only be possible under certain circumstances. It is totally not eugenics. Promise. It's not uncommon in East Asian ABO for there to be a protagonist set up with a potential suitor via a marriage arrangement or pre-arrangement interview, or parents telling you you're going to marry this person so your companies can merge. A family of alphas may want their alpha heir to procreate with another alpha to produce an alpha child. The male alpha-alpha couple of Okusama wa Alpha was set up as an arranged marriage for their family's mutual benefit with the knowledge that they will at some point have to produce an heir. And they navigate the uncomfortable reality that one of them is going to have to not only bottom, but carry the children. And in most Omegaverse stories, Omegas make up a smaller percentage of the population than Alphas, and finding a compatible Omega out of a small population of Omegas isn't easy. The Omega protagonist of Unmei no Tsugai Jie Omae Denante avoids setups by his parents regularly until he starts falling in love with an alpha that he enjoys pissing off. The alpha love interest of I Found You, My Omega has been contemplating marriage candidates since elementary school by the time he starts pursuing the protagonist. The alpha protagonist of Kakume no Alpha is the heir to a prestigious lineage, in love with his beta personal attendant, and both of them wish and wash over how to handle the inevitability of the alpha marrying Omega and producing an offspring with someone he doesn't love. The Alpha-Alpha-Omega trio in Yujo Haramase Tarangaru are split when the Omega's parents arrange for them to have kids with Alpha A, crushing Alpha B's one-sided love for Alpha A and ruining their whole ass friendship. And the Alpha-Omega pairing of Fatal Sense was originally set up by the Alpha's parents in hopes of his fire elemental affinity being balanced by the rare Omega's rarer water elemental affinity. Arranged marriages, or marriage interviews, are not really a thing in the US, and for
my fellow Americans
whose families don't bother with things that are necessary for the bloodline, story beats in which a character struggles between choosing what the family wants for the family and what the individual wants for themselves should have an obvious solution. In Omegaverse, and especially East Asian ABO comics, they often don't. It's not to say the US doesn't have its own problems, it definitely has its own problems. While we're thinking about this, there are 3 identities of Omegas I'd like to touch on real quick. Omegas as status symbols, Omegas as child bearers, and Omegas as tools for sexual gratification. An older unmated Omega is often seen as filthy or unwanted. The older unmated Alpha is often seen as weak or not very Alpha-like, but an Alpha with a mate or many mates has the right to flex, as mates are perceived as territory in the eyes of other Alphas. Because there are benefits to being paired, there can be a mutually beneficial relationship in which parties fulfill responsibilities for each other without romance being involved. Alphas and Omegas have needs that are best met by each other, biologically. An Alpha can have many of these relationships, while an Omega can only have one once they are paired. And though these relationships are mutually beneficial, the fact of the matter is that Omegas are biologically breedable and submissive, and that is where their value is seen as coming from. This even appears in the earliest Omegaverse manga. Romantic Jotaro has a protagonist Omega meet an Alpha that wants to use him as a broodmare with no strings attached. On that breedability, carrying and caring for children constitute the role that Omegas are defined by in the ABO hierarchy and biology. That purpose is the lens through which social structures often view Omegas. Think outdated gender norms like, women belong in the kitchen, I think I'd be pregnant and wearing slippers, doing this, that, and the other. The world pays no consideration to infertile Omegas or Omegas that don't want children because apparently they don't exist. Stories with these Omegas in them make up less of Omegaverse fiction in general than Omegas do of the Omegaverse alternate universe. Of the hundreds of Omegaverse comics I've read, I can only think of 2 off the top of my head that acknowledged adverse social impacts of infertility directly. The Korean webtoon Reversal, where alpha females are noted in the opening world building as alienated due to their pheromones and infertility, and the manga Kimi to Tsugai ni Narenai Ryu, which has an effectively infertile male Omega protagonist. My area of interest doesn't necessarily involve family settings. As expressed previously, pregnancy and taking care of small children are story elements that make me uncomfortable, but they exist in these stories and I can't not acknowledge their impact on the Omegaverse genre. The ideal couplings for producing children may vary, but there is usually a setup more or less likely to produce alpha children. This leads to things like arranged marriages, the maintenance of Omegas as status symbols, and eugenics. There are stories where Omegas have been wiped out due to diseases, where Omegas are second-class citizens, where Omegas are relegated to sex work and childbearing, where Omegas are bought and sold as property between high-class alphas, and all of that is for the sake of producing a stronger society and a better alpha, because you can't make the ideal alpha without an Omega. Most of the time. Genetic modification eliminates that need. The webtoon My Stallion takes place after designer babies and genetic modification have been outlawed in Korea. The protagonist Omega's condition is the reason the practice was banned. The alpha love interest was the reason the practice was revered. And that guy sells his sex to wealthy people that want the best alpha genes that have ever existed. We stan a hustling king. We aren't quite there with gene editing in reality, at least not to the point where we can choose sex or secondary gender or primary gender. So instead, we get instances like Ijiwaru na Sukai no Netsu ni Oborete and Yujo Haramase Tarangaru that both have an Omega set up with an alpha for the purposes of creating high-quality offspring with the greatest likelihood of presenting as alphas. Pendulum, Kemonohito Omegaverse, and Remnant Jujin Omegaverse take place in a version of the Omegaverse where only human Omegas are capable of producing alpha children, meaning that beastmen have to mate with a human Omega to continue their bloodlines. In a similar vein, storylines following different types of family dynamics aren't uncommon. These stories usually show the protagonist and their generation of the family as progressive with their own loci diverse in gender, presentation, and makeup. For starting a family, there are partners that want to start a family that come in every secondary gender combination. Alpha Alpha in Okusama wa Alpha, Alpha Beta in Kashiko Mari Mashita Destiny, Beta and Omega in Romantic Jotoru, and their single parenthood. A single Omega parent may purposely avoid developing a romantic relationship to protect their child, like in Kirai de Isasete, where he doesn't want to pursue his fated pair, or Struggle, where he avoids his child's father, or sometimes romance isn't expected to be in the cards, like Hyacinth Scent of Seasons. For blended families, sometimes families melt together. Alpha Nole Noko has a warm, positive relationship evolve between a single-parent Omega and an Alpha raising his younger brother. Anti-Moral Omegaverse has two Beta single parents wed before the story starts, making their Alpha and Omega sons siblings. And there are plenty of suboptimal family-related circumstances. Characters that have been forced to terminate pregnancies due to their circumstances, like the Omega in Kimiwa mo Kemanai, or Omegas that raised their children that came as a result from being assaulted, in stories like Oyasuminasai no Ato wa. There's uncertainty about who a child's sire is, like in One of the Four. And we can't forget stories where someone is forced to give birth where they don't want to. I am looking at you, Love is an Illusion. I am so sick of you. And on Omega submissiveness. Heat periods for the Omega not planning pregnancy serve only the function of sexual gratification. There are Omegas who choose sex work because of this. Even if they don't consciously want sex, their body wants sex, and that sex provides pleasure and relief. And that transaction, ironically, asserts dominance. The Omega that is sexually aware of and educated about their body as well as what they can do with it is freer from sexual limitations of their secondary gender in sexual encounters. Castate, Midara na Omega wa koi wo shinai, Sekutsuga, Omega-sama Nightclub, and Unmei no Kisu wa Oazuke are Omegaverse manga with knowledgeable, confident Omegas capable of wielding their sexuality. Unromantic has an Omega like this as well, but in that story, Omegas are the dominant secondary gender in the hierarchy, so it's functionally the same as if an Alpha is educated, but he's still an Omega, so I'm still mentioning it. This is but a brief overview of the Omega identity and what it might mean to be an Omegaverse in Omegaverse fiction. Every Omegaverse story with an Omega in it is in some way discussing or critiquing the in-universe perceptions of Omega sexuality. Perceptions of Omegas by Omegas, and of Omegas by others. The way secondary gender is utilized in Omegaverse, especially in East Asian comics, often contributes to the erasure of transgender and non-binary identities. Which is interesting and frustrating because there's a capacity for people to be gender nonconforming on the male to female spectrum, and secondary gender nonconforming as alphas, betas, and omegas, and they could be categorized further by dominant and recessive traits, or say, predator and prey traits, depending on the hierarchy in any given story. This erasure is everywhere, mind you, because the transes don't exist, and they make up such a small percentage of the population they don't deserve rights, but it's more common in Omegaverse works originating from East Asian countries than
the global West.
Open parentheses, derogatory, close parentheses. I can confidently say that you are more likely to find recognized trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and intersex characters in Slash than you are in manga, webtoons, or manhwa. Explaining why this is would require me to understand other cultures' views on gender on a level far beyond that which they present in media that I have consumed or read about or researched, and it is incredibly complicated, especially in regards to queer Chineseness, which is nothing like our conceptualization of queerness, and rest assured, I do make a concerted effort to white-splain it later. As a medium-based or cultural-based example, my guess for ABO manga would be that this is because gender is measured by sexual characteristics pertaining to secondary gender as opposed to social roles. Ergo, there's no need for further gender bending if you are using Omegaverse as a literary tool. The existence of the ABO dynamic and the genders in it imply that gender has already been bent. In boys love manga as a whole, male-male relationship portrayals used to often take the stance that love is detached from sex and gender, and this was used to perpetuate a lot of homophobic thinking. You would see this written to the effect of, I don't love you because you're a man, I love you because you're you, which in Omegaverse would translate to, I don't love you because you're an Omega, I love you because you're you. This is a very sweet way of reframing the age-old yaoi problem of, I'm not gay, you're the exception for me. Secondary sex would be a more technically accurate term for alpha, beta, and omega characteristics, since gender is a social construct and gender is detached from identity with queer Chineseness. It's complicated, but alpha, beta, and omega do have their own socially constructed gender roles in Omegaverse. So to look at Omegaverse sex and gender identity characteristics in their entirety, we have to account for primary biological sex on the male to female spectrum, gender identity pertaining to sex, secondary sexual characteristics, your secondary gender, and gender identity pertaining to your secondary sexual characteristics. Truly, it's baffling. But alas, no matter how hard we try to create blindness toward groups marginalized based on gender, sex, and sexuality, there is this entire thing called queer theory literary criticism based on Western, open parentheses, derogatory, close parentheses, understandings of queerness that specifically explores issues of sexuality, power, and marginalized populations. Purdue Owl explains it as gender studies and queer theory maintaining that cultural definitions of sexuality and what it means to be male and female are in flux. So relative to Omegaverse fiction, we would interpret this as gender studies and queer theory maintain that cultural definitions of sexuality and what it means to be an alpha, beta, or omega are in flux. There are many an ABO story we can read for filth queen through the lens of trans and non-binary issues, and clock for pushing cisnormative and heteronormative agendas, and Wolfman Dick Kink, and the fact I even have to acknowledge that an alternative universe kink subgenre about alternative gender identity somehow still pushes for cis and heteronormativity is ridiculous to me. For those interested in ABO comics with obvious trans and non-binary readings, a couple come to mind. In manga, there's Boku no Omega yo Semenaide, which has a trans reading for older people like me that haven't transitioned yet. The protagonist is an adult past the point of brain maturation who has had his whole life to come to terms with his secondary gender, because genetically he's 90% beta and 10% omega. It takes one whole sexual encounter with an alpha to trigger his omega characteristics and trans his secondary gender, and each subsequent encounter pushes him further toward becoming fully omega. There's a very real struggle as he negotiates with his identity long after puberty. Anti-Alpha has a trans reading and a discussion of how lovers handle a partner's transness. Rebirth has a reading on faking presentation with a beta protagonist who is committed to life as an omega in hopes of staying by his alpha best friend and lover, who the protagonist fears will leave if he finds out the truth, and the story follows his inner experience with the struggle of carrying such a heavy life for so long. In webtoons, there's Omega Complex, where the Omega protagonist uses cigarettes to disguise his pheromones and pretend he's a beta, because the alpha love interest from his youth hates Omegas. How to Be an Alpha has a reading because the Omega protagonist is traumatized and terrified of alphas, and his beta partner hasn't actually presented yet as an alpha when he's expected to, because he has internalized the protagonist's fears and anxieties regarding his trauma. And there's Lima syndrome, where the alpha protagonist is dangerously possessive over his best friend and roommate who is supposedly an omega. Supposedly. All of this is to say that criticism of sex and gender and sexuality and all that is alive and well in Omegaverse. It is simply confronted on an alternative axis that gives the creator freedom from our world's imaginary binary while exploring the same systemic issues. Omegaverse is unique to other speculative universes in that it is close enough to reality that you can transfer any contemporary fiction story into Omegaverse and pretty much have it translate one for one. Nothing needs to fundamentally change because Omegaverse functions as the world we live in. It just looks at our world with different eyes. As opposed to changing fiction to fit Omegaverse, Omegaverse fiction fits within contemporary fiction. It's just a recontextualization of what we already know. Sorry to say it, but we can't really recontextualize the elephant in the room, and the time has come to acknowledge it. Dubious consent inherent to Omegaverse, and agency and sexual consent in Omegaverse fiction. Oh my gosh, this is the subject of so much controversy surrounding Omegaverse, and it's largely where people who moralize Omegaverse end up stemming a lot of their opinions from, myself in the beginning included. The basic premises for the following discussion. Uno. Agency is required to give consent. B. Portrayal of social issues in media is relative to the perspective of the creator and the experiences that inform that portrayal. Premise number 1. I am from Ohio. Tragic, I know. Don't remind me. So when providing some explanation here, I'll be using the Ohio State University's Title IX policy. OSU has a weird relationship with our state capital and how state-level politics play out, but I'm sure their Office of Institutional Equity has no problems enforcing their policies and is completely 100% trustworthy. Agency is the capacity, condition, or state of exacting or of exerting power. It is the individual's ability to act on their free will. In the context of fiction, character agency on a meta level is measured by whether the characters make the story happen or let the story happen to them. How much influence a character has on a situation's outcome matters to the reader. The conditions that take away agency in sexual encounters are coercion and altered states of mind. Coercion is the application of pressure by the respondent that unreasonably interferes with the complainant's ability to exercise free will. An altered state of mind is when an individual cannot make rational, reasonable decisions because they lack the capacity to give knowing consent. Any condition that impedes on an individual's ability to make decisions takes away that individual's agency. Any action taken under coercive conditions or altered states of mind that affect the decision-maker's judgment or what the outcome of their decision would be is not an act of their agency. Consent is permission that is clear, knowing, voluntary, and expressed prior to engaging in and during an act. Consent is an assertion of an individual's agency. To give consent and to revoke consent is to exert power. Premise number 2. Portrayal of social issues in media is relative to the perspective of the creator and the experiences that inform that portrayal. Talking about ABO/fiction and original English fiction is not the same as talking about East Asian ABO narrative or comics. And talking about East Asian ABO narrative or comics isn't the same as talking specifically about Korean, Japanese, or Chinese ABO. This is true in general, of course, and of this project specifically. And for the record, I do not claim to be an expert in jack shit for culture beyond the United States. When analyzing social issues, in this case those of agency and sexual consent, in these Omegaverse works, it's neither fair nor correct to measure East Asian Omegaverse standards by my understanding of those issues. Before you go all herder cultural relativism bad on me, let me explain. A Twitter thread popped up in my feed from a Japanese to English translator that works on romance games for women, and a couple of her sentiments stood out to me and really solidified the importance of understanding this. What worked for an English audience 20 years ago doesn't work now. What works for a Japanese audience now often reads as sexual harassment to an English audience. Basically, every time I trip over something that is normal for a Japanese audience but will make the English audience go, huh? Or I tweak it. The romantic and sex scenes are in some sense the easiest to understand. They're meant to titillate the player, to let them enjoy feelings of love and desire. But again, what works for a Japanese audience doesn't work for an English one, so these are very often heavily rewritten. Diabolic lovers, where are you at? I have to admit that very few of the comics I read for this project had officially licensed English versions available at the time of me reading them. Translations aren't the same as localizations, but when there is an official or approved translation of a work, we can assume that that translation is accurate. In a localization, the direct translation of words is less meaningful than the preservation of the creator's intent. So we'd say that translation is for what was said. Localization is for what is meant to be felt. Actually did a huge project on this in an international literature class once. I love the gap between translation and localization. I did it all about the book The Last Temptation of Christ and how fucking cool it is. What this means in regards to the context of agency and sexual consent in fiction is that sexual assault is never okay. What is portrayed as sexual assault and how sexual assault is portrayed can look different through a different cultural frame. In the year of our Lord, 2020X, consent is mandatory. What consent looks like may vary. Now, gonna rub my little possum hands together. We can combine these premises and talk about wolf-like man dick kink with totally informed consent. Ta-da-da-da. ABO stories, regardless of where they're coming from, frequently toe the line of dubious consent and often vault right the fuck over that line into assault, by my American standards. Here's how ABO does both of the things that take away agency in sexual encounters, but inherently. Coercion! Alphas, as a class defined by social and sexual dominance, are portrayed as taking what they want. They can subjugate others with pheromones and commands. Betas are typically reluctant to put up a fight against this behavior, and omegas are naturally submissive to it. When faced with an alpha's orders, the expectation is for betas and omegas to obey. The biological compulsion to submit is reinforced by social norms. Mechanics of the pairing system work in a way that makes marking an omega useful as a threat or a promise when leveraged by alphas. Alphas can resolve their rut by nodding in any omega, but once paired, an omega can only be satisfied by their pair. In some stories, this is shown as a natural rejection, where a mated omega's body experiences trauma when someone other than their alpha tries to engage with them sexually. This is compounded by the fact that alphas are often portrayed as being able to form many pair bonds while omegas can only form one. The omega's biological purpose doesn't require them to make or break bonds, putting them in an unfavorable position for negotiation. And while it is possible that nothing will happen when an alpha breaks a pair bond or when that bond is removed surgically, most stories I read where it applied gave this action consequences, such as causing the omega to experience unstable heats, preventing the omega from pairing with another alpha, turning the omega into an unmated, unwed, and/or pregnant social pariah, traumatizing the omega mentally and physically, and shocking the omega's body into literally dying. Substantial impairment and altered states of mind. Heat, rut, fat, werewolf, nut. During an omega's heat or an alpha's rut, they produce significantly more potent pheromones, as previously mentioned. Pheromones are adapted, evolved, biologically designed to attract each other. They are an aphrodisiac. During heat, this is an unmatched contact high. It triggers primal instincts inside the alpha or omega's brain. An omega's heat or an alpha's rut can mean complete loss of reason for either. So with these things in mind, can an omega consent to a relationship with an alpha in any Omegaverse fiction? This question is an interesting parallel to second-wave feminism discourse about whether or not a woman can ever meaningfully consent to relations with a man in a patriarchal society. The omega who consciously refuses to mate with the alpha out of spite is kinda reminiscent of the radical side of political lesbianism. In Chapter 4, Dogfuck Rape World of Dr. Milena Popova's thesis, slight dubcon but they both wanted it hardcore, Dr. Popova uses sexual script theory to analyze 3 early supernatural fanfictions. Sexual scripts are the unspoken social rules of how a sexual interaction should unfold, what behaviors are acceptable, who may perform them, in what order. Countless ABO stories support a sexual script where alpha equals top and omega equals bottom, and reinforce our heteronormative and patriarchal sexual scripts where male equals top and female equals bottom. If the pairing is alpha-beta, the script is usually alpha-top, beta-bottom. Rare are the comics that subvert this, but I have read some, and here are a few. For manga, Boku no High-Spec-sama, A Tough Alpha Wants to Be Loved, Tsunaide My Hero, Norainu no Yoru, and Drastic Omega. And for webtoons, Oblivious Mr. B, My Sweet Yet Cruel Mate, and the alpha-beta side pairing in Best Friends. And again, Chinese Omegaverse manhwa is complicated. Asterisk. Is there a right way for a creator to show consent in Omegaverse, despite its dubious nature? No, there is not a right way to portray consent in Omegaverse. As a self-labeled expert, I would put portrayals of consent in Omegaverse on a spectrum of non-consensual to as consensual as the dubious nature of the Omegaverse universes allow. Even if we were to minimize all other imbalances, we'd end up in the same negotiations surrounding agency and consent that we do in reality. Can we ever meaningfully consent to relations with a person in XYZ circumstances? The secondary gender hierarchy is in the way of fully leveling the playing field between alphas, betas, and omegas on multiple axes, because we have to narrow the power gap between biological characteristics, social hierarchies, and class structures. And we don't have to nerf alphas to do this, but we do have to find ways to give betas and omegas the same power in civil and social systems, which requires equity as opposed to equality, which people don't understand. Kiss Me Liar gives omegas the power to create unbreakable pair bonds with alphas, which gives them the leverage typically held by alphas, but alphas maintain their other advantages. Unromantic maintains the hierarchical structure, but does so in a world where the omegas evolved as the dominant secondary gender. Dear Brand keeps alphas at the top, but omegas are trained from youth to hard counter and also assassinate alphas. As frustrating as it is for a lot of people to hear, we can't overcome social hierarchies by flipping them over. So long as one population is on top, this problem will recur. This requires gender abolitionism and class abolitionism to get there. As there's correlation between alphas and wealth, privilege, status, and... I don't really want to think about it anymore. To answer for consent in Omegaverse, hierarchies need to be flat, and consent has to be given prior to and during Heat and Rut and Fat Werewolf Nut, and it's too much, honestly. It's way too much. The power imbalance is slimmer in non-alpha omega pairings like relationships between alphas or alphas and betas or betas and omegas or polyamorous partners, but these relationships aren't safe from the gap and they're not safe from biological consequences. There's the process by which an alpha or a beta can be turned into an omega by repeatedly taking alpha semen and pheromones. In slash fiction, this is called bitching, as the alpha would be making their partner into the bitch male, and there's also the process by which an omega or beta can be turned into an alpha by having a partner submit to them and repeatedly exposing them to omega pheromones, which is called studding, and the person is being transformed into a stud. Neither bitching nor studding are common in East Asian ABO. They are more common in Korean manhwa than in Chinese manhwa or Japanese manga, and that's probably because the Korean understanding of sex and gender and sexuality is literally all based on stuff from the US because of colonization. And I am not meant to wax philosophical on this particular subject, I say, after having waxed philosophical on this particular subject. I would still consider this only an introduction to it, to help people understand why Omegaverse is often called problematic. When you hear people talk smack about Omegaverse, this is usually the first thing they're talking smack about. Can confirm, I was talking smack about this. Understanding agency and sexual consent in ABO to its fullest extent requires far more in-depth analysis than I've shared here. Fortunately, that analysis already exists in multiple instances and greatly informed my position here. I do hope, however, that this was a clear explanation regarding agency and consent in Omegaverse, and why Omegaverse is often looked at as a problematic genre. I am, however, meant to wax philosophical on fate, free will, and fucking philosophy. Grab your Kierkegaard, your Camus, your Sartre, your Nietzsche. We're about to feel real bad, my dudes. Existentialism is the philosophical theory that humans have control over their own actions. For our purposes, I want to temporarily separate the nebulous concept of free will from issues pertaining to individual agency like those with consent. Let's say that free will refers to an individual's ability to act against their fate, where fate refers to the lot in life that one is predetermined to experience. This approximate predetermination can be at the hands of gods, biology, garbage circumstances, any factor that has charted a course for a person without that person's input. That's fate. Agency refers to actions. Free will refers to the sum of actions. Are you with me? A loose concept of fated pairs has been part of Omegaverse since the beginning. In I Ain't No Lady But You'd Be the Tramp, if a bitch male wasn't knotted with a K while breeding with an alpha that was perfectly compatible, biochemically, hormonally, biologically, what have you, the bitch male would basically have a stroke. If the alpha didn't knot the bitch male's brain would short circuit, they would be in agony, and they wouldn't be able to climax. And this was a sign that they were mates. In the early 2010s, when this story takes place, the term mates isn't popular. It refers to a primitive side of human beings that the species as a whole kind of seeks to distance itself from. And this is interesting, because in the present day, English language ABO, original fiction, and fanfiction are written in a manner that the world largely understands the term mates de facto. It's not primitive, nor does it imply anything beyond the biological act of mating. It is a thing that is.
Now, people stopped using it because it stopped being true. It stopped accurately describing the relationship. So they looked for other words. Now, it's biology, gents. Don't mean that we're irrevocably bonded or that you belong to me, or that this isn't even something you can walk away from. It just means, well, it means the sex is great, and we need to start worrying about birth control.
Here, Jared is referring to how he free-knotted Jensen. Fuck, I wanna die. Free-knotting is when the alpha allows their knot to swell outside of their partner. The alpha uses the pressure of the knot outside to increase pleasure, since a knot with a K should not be shoved into any hole once it's swollen. Jensen had a stroke, and Jared realized they were mates because of it. The term mates refers to a scientific understanding of a soulmates-type bond. And Jared's criticisms of the term have nothing to do with the implications of soulmates or of a fate. His issue with mates is that it's primitive. I, however, have at least one issue with this scientific understanding of soulmates. Compatible alphas and bitch males could experience sudden attraction, but there were no explicit consequences to being with someone other than their mate. There were instead, supposedly, consequences to not knotting, with a K, consequences that the author wrote as allusions to real-world history.
Now, boy, you'd think it was a recent invention, like there's anything you can do in the sack that's actually new, but really it went out of practice completely in the Western world when Victorian sensibilities started to take hold. Drastically reduces the chance of conception, therefore it subverts the natural purpose of the act and goes against God, yada yada. And there was a lot of propaganda at the time that knotting the bitch keeps her healthy, that they need to get knotted, and that being denied the knot will lead to all kinds of problems. Back in the day, it was like hysteria or insanity, and nobody takes those seriously anymore. But modern wisdom holds that it can cause all kinds of physical illnesses, reproductive health mostly, but all kinds of things. Cancer, heart disease. I swear I read a thing once with doomsday predictions about a spike in osteoporosis around the time the first generation of career women start to get to the right age.
An appeal to nature is a logical fallacy that suggests a thing is good because it is natural, or a thing is bad because it is unnatural. This includes using human nature or the natural way as bases for ethical judgments. Don't do this, ever. Just no, never accept its human nature as an explanation or excuse for any human's consciously taken actions. Our capacity for reason is one of the things that separate adult humans from other animals. I would argue that in the case of I Ain't No Lady But You'd Be the Tramp, the aforementioned Victorian sensibilities were thinly veiled appeals to nature. And I think the primitivism contemporary social movements take issue with includes this appeal, because this appeal was being used as a legitimate justification for what we would now concretely view as rape. Animalistic behavior is the allure of Omegaverse, that's what it was made for, and even in Omegaverse's originary work, that allure was questioned. The OG author knew that this universe concept had the potential to be problematic, and embraced it, built on it. We can say that critiquing human nature is inherent to Omegaverse the same way that critiquing Omega's sexuality is. That's a good idea. Let's try that. Let's try critiquing human nature with Omega sexuality, or Omega sexuality through human nature. The nature of an Omega in heat is to produce seductive pheromones meant to attract alphas. If the omega produces pheromones to attract alphas, and the pheromones cause an alpha to go into rut, the nature of an alpha in rut is to relentlessly fuck the omega that attracted them. The alpha isn't in the wrong for fucking the omega seduced the alpha. Does this sound familiar to you? Because it should. This is the exact thought process of people that say, she was asking for it. In a sizable portion of Japanese Omegaverse, the omega is socially treated as the perpetrator in these instances. The law pins responsibility for assault on the omega who was assaulted. This is an appeal to nature using the omega's nature of seducing alphas to justify the alpha fucking the omega relentlessly, with or without their permission. The premise of a universe where animalistic behaviors are part of human civilization demands our human nature be criticized. Concerned yet? Good! It only gets worse from here! Creators' interpretations of fated pairs vary widely across cultural frames, but the mate's ancestry is ever present. The soulmate bond of fated pairs are a function of an alpha and omega's ability to determine their compatibility with one another. The most common presentation of this, regardless of origin, is that a perfectly compatible pair will experience each other's pheromones differently than they experience anybody else's. It sparks a compulsive attraction that surpasses all others. Biology is without morals. It cares not for the circumstances under which a person recognizes their fated pair. So long as the sniffed test is given, each sniffer must sniff the results eventually. In Sayonara Alpha, the teenage Omega protagonist meets his fated pair, and this poor kid is in physical pain, desperate to indulge his Omega nature, but his fated Alpha is 8 years old. If this sounds disgusting, congratulations, you are a reasonable human being. You understand the point of the story. Fate, unfortunately, is neither reasonable nor human, nor does it use any sort of rationality that we can base things off of. 'Tis a wretched fate that compels the accursed Omega to pursue his alpha, knowing that it makes his own physical condition worse. This kid abuses suppressant medications to protect himself and his alpha. The Omega never lays an indecent hand on his alpha while his alpha is a child. Instead of active Shotokan, the story's early chapters are about the Omega's negative feelings toward himself, and how animalistic desires toward a child clash with his identity and self-image. Seriously, he is not happy about it. Other examples of characters that have met with a terrible fate, haven't they, can look like Tubanme no Alpha, where the alpha's fated omega is already married and mated to another alpha, or The Last Omegaverse, where the alpha and omega are the only two non-betas left in society because the alpha and omega secondary genders have been extinct for like 100 years, or Anti-Moral Omegaverse, where a fated alpha and omega meet when their parents start dating and spend their childhood as stepbrothers. Stepbrother! I'm stuck in my bedroom with my he. Come give me your fat nut. And each of these stories treats fated pairs as explicitly real bonds between alphas and omegas, and the fated pairs in them end up together, even if an individual's agency affected the route they took. The hand of fate guided them to fate's intended destination. This is why I've separated agency from free will. Agency is small. It's our ability to take a given action by asserting our own power. Free will is unconscionably large. The inner machinations of free will are an enigma. Assuming fate exists, every act of our agency can be the work of fate. We can act against fate and still end up exactly where fate wants us. If that's true, is it possible, under any circumstances, for a fated pair to end up together as an outcome of exercising free will? I don't think so. It's dubious in the same vein that sexual consent is with regards to agency. Agency wouldn't affect the predetermined outcome of fate. Fate can predetermine an alpha and omega choosing not to be together right now, or could predetermine a pair believing that they're together for reasons other than fate. Assuming there is no way to remove oneself from the condition of having a fated pair, there will always be a case present that it was fate that the pair got together. If that condition could be removed, would it take one partner removing themselves from fate, or would it take both, since the other person's fate may not be changed by that erasure? That depends. What is fate in the context of that story? Is it biological? Is it spiritual? Is it anything at all? So long as the attraction between a fated pair is irresistible and the bond is unbreakable, there is no free will to be had. Defying one's fate is a common storyline in East Asian ABO I've read, though I'd have to do math to determine whether it's more or less common than hooking up with one's fated pair. A few ABO manga where characters end up with someone other than their fated pair. Ineritu Omega wa yoru ni oborete. The main Omega's fated alpha was traumatized growing up after his mother left their family for her fated pair. Running away deteriorated her mental health to the extent that she chose to have her pair marking surgically removed. Her regrets now live as permanent physical damage to her body. Romantic Lament speculates that the tale of fated pairs was a love story all people longed for. The Omega protagonist's heart nearly stops when he meets his former lover for the first time in years and he experiences whatever that fate is, and it's actually his ex's brother. He's just shit-faced. The alpha of Sutenai de My Hero is already paired by the time he meets his fated Omega, and as Rut consumes his ability to think coherently, he has to be stopped from mating with his fated Omega by his partner and their mutual friends. The Omega of Kimiwa mo Kemenai once believed that his former mated alpha was his fated pair, but the alpha knocked him up, left, and broke their bond, and the Omega doesn't get to keep the kid and doesn't end up with him. Shonen no Kyokai has two main couples, and in this story, the alphas are in relationships with each other's fated pairs. And you know what? Their lives are all better for it. But what if we got even more specific with this understanding? What if we directly equated fated pairs to mates? In this case, fated pairs is a colloquial term specifically describing the scientific concept of perfect biological compatibility. I am no logician, nor lawyer, mathematician, philosopher, or other logical proof user, but I want to work through this idea of scientifically measurable fate. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, that the term fated pairs refers to a pairing that is perfectly compatible biochemically, hormonally, biologically, what have you. The implication of this understanding is sexual compatibility. It is a combination of genetics that make these individuals ideal sexual partners. But for what purpose are their ideal sex partners? Pleasure, of course, is one. It'd be nice to have the objectively best sex, or never needing to buy deodorant if you like your partner's scent. But say hypothetically, within the very real biological binary, both females and males can get pregnant. Based on scientific knowledge of sexual reproduction, we would assume that there was a biological reason for human males with exclusively male genitalia to adapt, evolve, overcome, transdifferentiate into having a womb. Doesn't matter how it happened or why it happened, people who only have male genitalia also have a womb now. And say that there was no interference with human adaptation or evolution. No gods, no kings, no scientific tinkering by the New World Order to make everyone hermaphroditic. In this case, what was the biological reason for people with exclusively male genitalia evolving into having wombs? Dude, reproduction. That's how we continue the species. That's how that works. If it happened, there's a need for males to be able to carry children. This suggests that biological compatibility is a measurement of a pair's fertility. It is a measurement of how good at reproducing that pairing would be. With this understanding, a fated pair is a pair that is optimal for producing offspring. If fate is understood as what is meant to be, then the socially prescribed fate of humans is that humans are meant to seek out optimal partners for the purpose of procreation. Dude, that ain't fate. This is fate. That is biological min-maxing. That is biological metagaming, and I hate it. Thanks for asking. I have a number of feelings on this realization, none of which make me feel any better at all whatsoever. Inconsolable despair and vindicated nihilism are great for universe brain 2000 IQ, but not for actually feeling things. So feel free to accuse me of caring too much about semantics here. You would not be wrong, but this feels bad. Scientific fate understood from this framing feels bad. Existential dread refers to the negative feelings that come as a result of existing. Non sequitur! It's the misery that comes with freedoms, responsibilities, and the conflicts between them. This is also known as existential anguish, angst, or anxiety. Despite What I've said thus far, I wouldn't call Wolfcock Kink depressing, but now that I've opened your universe brain to the possibilities, I am obligated to articulate the ways in which the prettiest romantic part of Omegaverse is ugly as sin. The mechanics of pair bonding ensure that Omegas take on more risk in any given relationship than non-Omegas do. You will find no disagreements here with the position that Omegas have it rough in Omegaverse. It is the common position. It is more common than mating press. Because Omegas are in less favorable positions than Alphas, it is easy to overlook the anxieties that plague Alphas the same way they plague Omegas. Will I ever meet my fated pair? What if my fated pair is already bonded? What if my fated pair rejects me? What if I'm not permitted to be with my fated pair? Do I even have a fated pair? If I have a fated pair, what does it mean for the rest of my life thus far? What does it mean for my future? What does it mean for my fated pair's future? I don't want to lose my sense of self to biological impulses. I don't want to be an animal. I don't want to feel disgusted by myself. I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be judged based on my gender, my secondary gender. I don't want biology to dictate my potential. I don't want to carry the weight of the world's expectations. This doesn't mitigate the fact Omegas categorically have it worse, but that conversation has been had too many times by too many people, and I have nothing new to add. So I want to present a more critical way of looking at the shared experiences of Alphas and Omegas. Intersectionality, baby! So I'm going to talk about a manga that I think perfectly captures the intersection between Alphas and Omegas in regards to fate. In the Cage has a love triangle between an Omega named Haru and his two childhood friends that are Alpha brothers, Eiji and Renji. Eiji, the younger brother, has stayed with Haru since they were kids. Renji, the older brother, is Haru's fated pair. Eiji and Renji have always known that Renji is Haru's fated alpha. Despite this, Eiji has possessively kept Haru close to his side. When Renji left them to study abroad, Eiji and Haru comforted each other. Haru's family neglected him and later abused him because of his Omega characteristics. And for a number of years, Eiji helped Haru with the stress and the estress. But around the time the story starts, Eiji is set up with another Omega, and he is no longer able to devote himself to Haru. At the same time, Eiji is distancing himself, Renji comes home. We learn that when they were all children, Renji arranged a bargain with their father. As the eldest son, Renji would eventually become the family head. His partner would be chosen for him. He agreed to meet a set of his father's expectations, and in exchange, he would be with Haru, and only Haru. Nobody in Renji and Eiji's family or Haru's family would be permitted to interfere with their lives. Eiji would become the family's proper heir. Eiji, whose possessiveness over Haru conflicts with his responsibilities now, demands that Renji stop stringing along Haru after leaving them both. And Haru, who is still conflicted, is there with them when Renji says,
"You have everything, Nisan. Isn't it fine if you give Haru to me? You're the one who said that. Just Haru. I only need Haru. I don't need anything if Haru is here with me. That's why I gave you everything that was on me, like a pile of garbage. Parents and everything. Do you plan to make Haru live his whole life with shitty people like them?"
Renji, from the moment he met Haru, when they were children, was already set on throwing away everything else in his life, his family, inheritance, security, everything that came with his privileged position, so he could be with Haru. And Renji is well aware of how unhealthy his feelings toward Haru are. He makes no secret of them. Even after Haru chooses him, he repeatedly gives Haru the opportunity to back out. As they're about to enter their new home for the first time, Renji says,
"If you step inside, even if you beg and cry, I will never let you go. I'm not a kind person like you imagined. I want you to only look at me and think only of me. You should only want me, and I want to make it so you cannot live without me."
Later, Eiji admits to being jealous of his older brother because Eiji wanted to be Haru's fated partner. But Renji tells him,
"It's not beautiful like that. desire that person enough to even throw away your family. When you finally have him, you don't want to show him to anyone's eye. You don't want others to touch him. His sight, voice, breath, and even a single strand of his hair. I might go crazy if I don't make him all mine.
Renji reminds Eiji that Eiji chose to distance himself from Haru when they both knew Haru's circumstances. Isolated, mistreated, despised by his own family, but as Renji points out, Eiji wasn't willing to make the necessary sacrifices to be Haru's freedom. In exchange for Haru's life,
I will give my everything to him. It's impossible for you. That couldn't choose only how to.
Renji and Haru make a lovely pair, though Renji would never let anybody else see that. He has no intention of introducing his co-workers or associates to Haru. Renji isolated himself from his fated partner, and his brother and family for that matter, for upwards of a decade and buried himself in his responsibilities until he reached his father's expectations. Every agonizing moment, every lonely night, all of it was in pursuit of Haru. Renji didn't force Haru to choose him either. He gave Haru space to consider the relationship with Eiji and weigh his potential future options. Renji is relieved when Haru chooses him, because Renji is well aware of what kind of person he is. His brother told Haru, and he confirmed it to Haru himself more than once, because Renji didn't expect Haru to choose him. He fully believed that Haru wouldn't choose him. In his head, the mixed feelings of wanting Haru and wanting Haru to be happy conflict because of his own possessive desires and everything that he had to throw away to pursue them. Renji locks Haru in a gilded cage, but Haru chose to enter that cage, and Haru is free because of it. Renji, on the other hand,
Haru was the only one I saw shining in my world. My light, my fate, a person who gave meaning to me for being an alpha. When Haru chose me, I thanked a god who I believed never existed.
bang bang goes Chekhov's gun. I've at last explained what my topic is, and next time we will actually talk about the topic. What have I done? Thank you for sharing so much of your mental energy with me. I know you really didn't have to, and it's hard to sit through long things like this. I really didn't want to sell myself until I had released both parts together. And even now, I'm only adding this as an afterthought. Everything that you've seen here is one person. It's just me. Aside from the stuff that I've given credit to and the art and the assets and whatnot, this was a one-person show. The script is over 30,000 words, and if I format it properly, it's over 200 pages. I made a feature-length film about Omegaverse just so I could make a feature-length film about Omegaverse that makes sense. So if you got something out of this, whether you liked it, loved it, hated it, thought it was funny, were entertained by it, enjoyed it, shared it with your friends, and made shit posts and bad jokes about it, or if you just want to be like, hell yeah, brother, I would greatly appreciate it if you considered helping game the YouTube algorithm that's a lot nicer to small creators now by liking, commenting, sharing it with your homies to antagonize them about Omegaverse so they have to suffer in the same ways you're now suffering with Omegaverse. If you subscribe, you'll know as soon as part 2 comes out. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll definitely know when part 2 comes out. Part 2 shouldn't be more than a month away. Like, I've already recorded and re-recorded the audio for this project multiple times. It's effectively done as far as I'm concerned. I have a Patreon that should have gone live alongside this video that already has bonus stuff up there. That's kind of cool if you ask me. I have a Ko-fi page. I would love to do more in the future, although maybe not so much on this exact subject. I really wanted to talk about the media and literature and cultural stuff all in one script, even if it meant that I had to split it into 2 separate videos because it got too long. Truth be told, I don't know when between mental illness and material conditions and circumstances, I'll have the wherewithal to do another project of this size again. This has really been a challenge for myself. There are more things I want to write, stories I want to tell, scripts I haven't written yet that I have ideas for that I think would be pretty cool. I really want to talk about how Genshin Impact views other countries and why it feels that way. Love to do another Barbie video someday, like a shorter one maybe, about Princess Charm School. I would certainly love to do more like this on any number of topics I haven't even thought about yet. Imagine something you can't even imagine, dude. Writing is the thing I love the most in this world. I want to do something like this again. I'd love to do it more than once, repeatedly even, if I was so fortunate as to have the opportunity. Sharing things like this for me is kind of intimate. I really like showing other people what's in my head. I need it to get out. I needed you to listen to this. I needed someone else to know as much as I know about Omegaverse, otherwise I was going to lose my fucking mind. This will be the final reminder to like, comment, subscribe. Please consider supporting via Patreon or Ko-fi or something to that effect. Honestly, like, we've seen the world as it is now. I won't be offended if you don't, but I'd really appreciate it if you considered it, if you got something out of this. Or if you didn't get something out of this, but your friend got something out of this. Or if you could just share this to one of the Omegaverse communities that I don't currently participate in. Like, I won't touch Wattpad with a 10-foot pole because everyone on there feels 12 and I'm way too old for that. Okay. I think we're good. I hope to see you in the comments.